There are nights when the whole world falls silent, not because all is well, but because the storm is still holding its breath. On the world map, the Middle East is just a small strip of land, yet every time it trembles, humanity pauses. Not because of geography, but because of history, because of blood, and because of a string of wounds that have never truly healed. People used to say, as long as guns are fired in the Middle East, humanity will never find peace. But this time, the explosion doesn't just shake that land, it pierces through the borders of every assumption, every alliance, every pride once thought untouchable. When a missile leaves its launcher, it's not just a weapon, it's a declaration, an accusation. Despair given form, and sometimes it's the final scream of those who no longer have a choice. June 12th, a night with no moon, no wind, and no warning. Yet it was the night when the skies over the Middle East lit up with blazing fire one after another, as if someone had flipped the switch for the apocalypse. In Tehran, missile launcher trucks that had been quietly deployed for weeks suddenly began to operate as if pre-programmed. No fanfare, no speeches, no diplomatic briefings, just a series of scattered commands transmitted over internal radio waves. Fire, then silence, and after that, a rain of steel flew westward. On the other side, Israel, a nation long revered and feared for its formidable military power, seemed completely unaware of what was coming. Quiet seaside towns, ancient religious neighborhoods, and the gleaming skyscrapers of Tel Aviv all still bathed in nightlight, showing no signs of alarm. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the sound. It was the absence of sound. No sirens, no immediate response from the world-renowned air defense system, no swift statements from the Ministry of Defense or the Israeli Prime Minister. And when the first strike finally hit, it wasn't the people who awoke. It was trust, the trust Israel had built over decades, that began to crack. A former soldier who once served in southern Israel wrote on social media, "I've never been this afraid, because I no longer know what to believe in." When fear no longer comes from the enemy, but from not knowing who will protect you, that's when trust collapses quietly without a sound. Tel Aviv, once hailed as the thriving heart of Israel, was no longer itself that morning. The blare of car horns was gone, the sun no longer reflected off the city's towering glass buildings, and the usual morning cafes didn't open their doors. In their place were black smoke, the acrid smell of burnt material, and the frantic footsteps of people rushing toward shelters, in a state of utter panic. The night before, every sign of danger had either been ignored or never showed up at all. No warnings, no preparations, not a single alarm from the famed defense systems that once gave Israelis precious seconds to save themselves. But this time, those seconds never came. They were stolen by cold, calculated surprise. Iran had struck, and they did it as if every detail had been mapped out, every target, every breath of Israel. It wasn't a spontaneous attack, nor an emotional act of retaliation. It was a war plan composed like a symphony, where each note was an explosion, each chorus a piercing blow to the heart of national confidence. Bat Yam, a peaceful coastal city where children once played on golden sands every evening, was among the first to be hit. A row of apartment buildings was ripped apart by a cruise missile. No one had time to react. 3 children died in their sleep. Their father, a bus driver, cradled their lifeless bodies in the rubble, eyes vacant, too broken to cry. That image wasn't just a tragedy, it was a deafening wake-up call. This time, Israel was no longer standing on higher ground. Domestic media fell into an eerie silence. Newscasters didn't deliver their usual updates. Emergency broadcasts were delayed. All eyes turned to the Ministry of Defense, waiting for a response, a statement, any sign that control was still in hand. But until the next morning, the only thing that aired was a call for calm. With no footage of intercepted missiles, no affirmations of sovereignty, just a single line scrolling across the screen. Please remain indoors. The situation is being handled. That silence to the Israeli people was more terrifying than the sound of falling bombs. They were used to seeing the military speak out, the prime minister appear within hours of any crisis. But this time, no one spoke. And when a powerful government chooses silence, that's no longer a strategy. It's a crack deep within the core of power. Doubt began to spread. Not doubt about the enemy, but doubt about the very security that had always seemed unshakable. People asked each other, where is the Iron Dome? Where's David's sling? Why wasn't even one missile intercepted? A former military commander posted briefly on social media, "We put too much faith in technology, but war was never just about technology." A short sentence, but one that cut deep into the national pride that once built their sense of invincibility. In schools, children stayed home. Teachers messaged parent groups, indefinitely postponed. People began hoarding water, stocking up on food. Supermarkets, once quiet thanks to a history of tight defenses, were now flooded with crowds grabbing whatever they could carry. No one knew what would come next. No one believed things would be brought under control as quickly as in the past. In the darkness of bomb shelters, Israeli families experienced for the first time a feeling they once thought only Gazans understood, the fear that their roof might not be there by morning. And while the entire country braced itself in uncertainty, one message spread like a lightning bolt through every call, every emergency chat. Kiryat had been hit. Kiryat, the nerve center of Israel's military, the supreme command headquarters nestled in the heart of Tel Aviv, once considered impenetrable, was no longer intact. Just one missile was enough to shake the entire system. And the most terrifying truth was this: no one even saw it coming. No Iron Dome, no early warning radar, no sirens, no defense buttons pressed. A deadly silence fell, not just over the ground, but inside the minds of those who once believed this was the final fortress of national security. Military experts and international strategic analysts began openly debating across global media. Was this a technical failure? Or was it a new kind of attack? One capable of deceiving even Israel's AI-powered defense systems? The answer, at that moment, remained unclear. But the consequences were undeniable. If Kiryat could be breached, then who or what place could still be considered safe? No one was sure of anything anymore. And in that confusion, Israel realized that this time, it wasn't just their infrastructure under attack, it was their symbol, their command center, the very thing that stood for their ability to control any situation. A symbol collapsing, even for a few seconds, was enough to shake the foundations of a strategic doctrine decades in the making. And this was only the beginning. Once an enemy has pierced your hardest armor, they don't need to keep breaking through. All they have to do is spread uncertainty, and that alone can turn the next strike into a fatal blow. Israel, a country with one of the most advanced early warning systems in the world, had suddenly become the one who didn't hear the enemy's footsteps approaching its very doorstep. And in the haze of shock not yet lifted, they would face something even more horrifying. The steady targeting of their core strengths, science, infrastructure, technology, each being struck bit by bit with precision, ruthlessness, and nothing left to chance. Kiryat, the name once invoked as the ultimate symbol of Israel's defensive strength, was a tightly guarded military complex in the heart of Tel Aviv, under 24/7 surveillance. It wasn't just the place where strategic commands were issued, it was the neural hub of the entire Israeli military. Every radar signal, every emergency situation, every missile response was processed there. In this place, the concept of sleep didn't exist. Surveillance systems ran through the night. Senior officers stayed glued to screens, tracking the slightest movements in the skies. And yet, in the briefest moment just before dawn on June 13th, an unmanned aerial vehicle, or perhaps a cruise missile, struck part of the command center. The building didn't collapse, but the blow was enough to shake the foundation of belief in the facility's ability to protect itself. The problem wasn't just the physical damage, it was how it happened. Quietly, undetected, unstopped, no alarms, no response from any air defense system. It's still unclear whether it was a technical failure or a security gap that had been exploited. But for the Israeli public, who had believed Kiryat was untouchable, the details didn't matter as much as the consequence. The realization that even the heart of the military system could be hit. And if that's possible, then nowhere can be truly safe. In the brief news updates that followed, officials only spoke of an incident under investigation. But that ambiguity only fueled more doubt. The international press jumped in immediately. CNN called it the most precise and symbolic strike on Israel's command mechanism in over a decade. The Guardian remarked, "This is no longer a military attack, it's psychological warfare." And truly, Kiryat didn't fall in the physical sense. It collapsed in people's hearts. Young officers grew anxious. Emergency meetings were held non-stop. but none could deliver a strong, unified message. Senior commanders avoided the cameras. Strategic analysts took turns on TV, trying to appear composed, yet their words betrayed deep concern. For Israelis, long accustomed to living in a state of constant defense, this surprise blow felt like a strike to the heart. And the most painful part wasn't the impact itself. It was the feeling of no longer knowing what to believe in. When the very place that was meant to protect you now needs protection, what's left to keep you standing in the storm? A leaked photo of the aftermath inside Curia revealed a hallway dusted in debris, a collapsed wall, and scattered military documents on the floor. No one died, but the damage was immeasurable. An anonymous defense official admitted, "We've never faced a strike like this. No sound, no light, no signal. Only the aftermath." And that aftermath, it seems, had been calculated in advance, as if Iran's goal wasn't just physical destruction, but the annihilation of trust, the very foundation of this nation's strength. From that point on, no one saw the Curia incident as an isolated event, because soon after, a series of other key locations, long considered strategic pillars, also began to come under fire, each hit with increasing precision and ferocity. But the most frightening shift was when war no longer distinguished between military and civilian targets. When what was being destroyed wasn't just bunkers or barracks, but the centers of intellect, science, and everyday life. That was the moment war revealed a new face, not just of bloodshed, but of the slow unraveling of everything that once made a nation proud to stand for progress, innovation, and hope. And that face became clearer than ever, just hours after the strike on Curia, when the skies above Haifa, Rehovot, and the rooftops of Israel's leading academies trembled in unison under a new wave of explosions. Haifa, the northern port city of Israel, once not only a hub of trade, but also the nation's energy capital, had long gazed out over the Mediterranean with pride. Its oil refineries, national power grid, and industrial chemical storage facilities operated around the clock, forming the backbone of modern life for millions. But just one night after the strike on Curia, Haifa too was engulfed in fire and smoke. Before residents could even grasp what was happening, the city's power system began to flicker. Street lights dimmed, gas stations shut down, sirens stayed silent. Not because there were no defenses, but because the strike on Haifa wasn't aimed at life, it was aimed at the systems that sustain life. A major gas pipeline exploded. Thick black smoke rose from the industrial zone near dense residential areas, triggering a wave of panic that rippled down the coastline. Aerial footage captured the destruction of factory rows in a distinct arc, a clear sign that the attackers had carefully calculated the trajectory and points of impact. And the horror didn't stop there. Rehovot, home to the Weizmann Institute of Science, was next. Known as Israel's national intellect, it was the birthplace of some of the country's most groundbreaking scientific advancements, where top researchers in AI, molecular biology, and quantum physics worked tirelessly. But all of that came to a halt. A missile, shockingly precise, struck the biological research lab focused on the immune system, a project once expected to revolutionize defense medicine. Rooms that once glowed with bright white lights and humming machines were now filled with smoke, debris, and ruin. Research equipment worth tens of millions of dollars was incinerated. Documents and data were lost before they could be backed up. Decades of intelligence, effort, and dreams of contributing to humanity were erased in a matter of seconds. This was no longer military warfare. This was a strike on the highest tier of a civilized nation, science. While the military scrambled to rebuild its defensive response chain after the Curia shock, research centers, universities, power stations, and telecommunications networks were being systematically visited by a series of high-precision weapons, not the kind used in mass attacks, but selective, deliberate tools. Each strike was a message. An elder professor from Hebrew University said on national radio, "I never imagined the day would come when we, researchers, would become targets of war. The weapons now don't just aim at armies, they aim at what makes us advance." Public sentiment began to shift. People were no longer asking, "How will we retaliate?" but instead, "What do we have left to lose?" The pride in national intellect, something Israel had long cultivated as a global identity, wasn't shattered by shells, but by a creeping fear that nowhere was beyond reach. Even satellite communication stations, the arteries of emergency messaging, were jammed or disrupted. As panicked citizens tried to contact loved ones, hotlines were overwhelmed, social media cut in and out, and radio stations played the same calming melodies on loop over and over. The silence in communication, in an age where information is the ultimate weapon, was a fatal blow to the fragile sense of control in a nation spiraling deeper into crisis. And it was within that very space, where energy centers had collapsed, scientific systems were paralyzed, and social activity had begun to fracture, that people realized Israel was no longer in control. They were being led, not by a full-scale assault, but by carefully aimed knives striking at just the right places, slowly, precisely, and with chilling intent. From Gaza, from Lebanon, from Syria, even from deep within Iran, leaked information revealed this wasn't an attack from a single front. It was a symphony of multiple forces, all playing toward one goal: to shatter the image of Israel as a nation untouchable. In a bunker near Nazareth, an international journalist quietly typed his final message before the signal cut out. "I don't know who's winning, but I'm watching a nation, with all its pride, science, and technology, suddenly gripped by fear, like people who have nothing left to defend." In the southern cities, high-tech engineers, once hailed as national treasures, were packing their bags and leaving Tel Aviv. No one told them to. No one forced them. It was simply that when every pillar, from military to intellect to infrastructure, can collapse in minutes, survival instinct urges you to step back. And in that wave of quiet departures, what was evaporating wasn't just people, it was trust. No explosion echoed louder than the gradual loss of faith in a society that once took pride in being a global center of innovation. In empty cafes, TVs still played out of habit. Then a breaking news flash lit up the screen. Herzliya, the location of Mossad's strategic offices, had just been hit. No prior alarm. No cameras caught it in time. No shield thick enough. Just an explosive charge placed exactly where the underground entrance was believed to be. And the next image was a dense, dark plume rising from the center of a city once regarded as the sacred ground of power and intelligence. That single event, despite no confirmed casualties, was enough to send shivers through the elite. And from that moment, the war shifted into a new dimension, where symbols no longer stood tall on the pedestals of glory they were once built upon. An era of invulnerability was vanishing into smoke. Herzliya had long been dubbed the underground city of Israeli power, a place where money alone couldn't buy you access. It wasn't the capital, nor an open military center, but it was home to covert intelligence offices and national security hubs, discreetly hidden beneath buildings that appeared to house only finance or real estate firms. Residents of Herzliya usually paid little attention, or chose not to know what lay beneath the ground they walked on each day. Because everyone understood implicitly that the less you knew, the safer you were. But that morning, what Herzliya's citizens saw wasn't the sunrise. It was a thick black column of smoke spiraling into the sky from a quiet residential street. Fire sirens shrieked, ambulances screamed, and dark uniformed figures, no names, no ranks, emerged from hidden underground entrances. It was chaos like the city had never seen. Then, a newly built structure that seemed to be a shopping center suddenly collapsed at its base, revealing a thick, specially reinforced concrete layer, clearly not meant for the public, but for an intelligence data facility. No one made a statement. No official announcement was issued. But everyone knew. Mossad, the legendary agency considered untouchable, whose intelligence network spans the globe, had been breached. Somehow, a part of that system had been struck on its own soil. And in the world of strategy, that was a slap in the face to Israel's entire psychological defense infrastructure. A local resident just 2 blocks from the blast told live television, "We don't know what happened, just felt a jolt, then silence. But what scared me most wasn't the explosion, it was the silence after. No one came to reassure us, no one told us what to do. It was as if they didn't know either." The damage didn't stop at Herzliya. Caesarea, an ultra-exclusive residential enclave where only Israel's most powerful could own property, was next. Home to former prime ministers, national corporate leaders, and even the family of current Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, this area had always been considered impenetrable, guarded around the clock by the most advanced private defense systems. Every home had an underground bunker, Every fence was lined with motion sensors. And yet, in the scorching heat of midday, a hypersonic missile cut through airspace and slammed into the rear wall of the villa believed to house the Prime Minister's family. No lives were lost. No fire broke out. But it was enough, because what was destroyed wasn't architecture, it was symbolism. It was the shell of confidence, the fragile divide between leaders and the ordinary people. Citizens saw with their own eyes that even the head of the nation could be targeted. Not on a battlefield, but inside his own home. A video captured from afar went viral across social media, showing smoke rising from the villa while a team of agents rapidly secured the perimeter. International reporters quickly labeled it an unprecedented event in modern Israeli history, a moment when the country's leadership was openly targeted, with no more red lines, no more safety zones. And then, the most chilling realization settled across the public. No one could be sure what might come next. If one of the world's most capable intelligence agencies could be breached, if the head of state was no longer completely protected, what, if anything, was safe? Was anyone truly immune to war anymore? Or was this the wake-up call that modern warfare doesn't just aim at armies, but at memory, at dignity, at the collective trust of a people? Israeli society transformed at a staggering pace. High-end residential areas began adding steel reinforcements. Security cameras were installed at unprecedented speed. Government press conferences turned cautious, defensive rather than reassuring. In schools, defense lessons were replaced with evacuation drills and survival strategies in case of total communication blackout. Hospitals activated soft war mode, mentally preparing for the wave of casualties expected from coming attacks. And as society began to operate in a state of quiet emergency with no declarations, no rallying cries, it became clear Israel's leadership had to act. Silence was no longer an option. They couldn't keep absorbing blow after blow without striking back, because if they did, Israel would no longer be Israel, the nation known for its preemptive strike doctrine, for never giving its enemies a second chance. So within just 36 hours of the strike on Caesarea, Israel launched its first counteroffensive. But this time, they didn't target missile factories or military depots. They targeted a symbol, just as they had been targeted. In Tehran, as the state broadcaster aired its evening news, the screen suddenly went black mid-sentence. The anchor had just begun to say, "The situation in the region is under control," when the transmission cut out. National television was disrupted. Later footage revealed the studio had been destroyed by a long-range strike. A silent message was sent. Israel had struck back, and they had chosen to hit a symbol, an image, a mental stronghold, mirroring the way they themselves had been struck. Just hours later, news broke that Iranian media facilities in Qom and Mashhad had also been disabled by high-intensity electronic warfare. A white signal sweep jammed the entire broadcast infrastructure. Iranian citizens, unaccustomed to being stripped of information, were left in confusion. In cafes, phones couldn't connect, TVs displayed only static gray. The silence of media, once a tool for sowing fear in Israel, now turned back on its source. And amidst that ambiguous storm of information, a rumor spread like wildfire across the Middle East. Israel was considering an unprecedented move in modern history, the assassination of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. This was not merely escalation. It was the thin, volatile line between conventional war and total war. As terms like assassination, direct retaliation, and global alert echoed across international media outlets, one thing became clear: this war was no longer confined to a strip of land or a bilateral conflict. It was spreading, and it was now touching the most sensitive nerves of the modern global order. Since the strike on Caesarea and the blackout of Iran's national television, the atmosphere in the Middle East was no longer a quiet tension. It had thickened into a dense cloud of direct threats. Israel, long known for its swift, uncompromising retaliation, had been pushed to the edge of instinctual defiance. And they responded not just with missiles, but with calculated blows meant as a global warning. There was no more denial or obfuscation. For the first time, an Israel Defense Forces spokesperson admitted on international television, "We are responding to a systematic series of attacks aimed at the very foundations of the Israeli state, and our response will be proportionate, without limits of scale or range." That statement wasn't just for Iran. It was a message to the world. From here on, this war would no longer follow any traditional rules. That very night, waves of F-35 jets launched from Negev Air Base heading east. But their target wasn't Tehran. It was communication hubs, command centers, and data repositories located in satellite regions around Iran, including parts of Syria and Iraq. These strikes didn't cause mass casualties, but they paralyzed infrastructure. Iran's internet connectivity dropped by nearly 40% in just 6 hours. A data center near Isfahan was destroyed, erasing millions of citizen records permanently. But perhaps what shocked the world most wasn't the numbers. It was a short, shaky video clip that spread like wildfire across Twitter and Telegram. In the video, a figure believed to be Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei appeared in flickering light, escorted urgently by special forces through what looked like a bunker exit. There was no speech, no threat, just silence and urgency. Western media swiftly reported Israel had successfully hit a communications node near Khamenei's residence, forcing an emergency evacuation. Though unverified, political analysts across the globe agreed. This was the opening act of a political assassination campaign, one without precedent. And when a figure like Khamenei, symbol of supreme authority in Iran, was stripped of media control and freedom of movement, it wasn't just a personal fall. It was a rupture in the political nervous system of the entire region. In Moscow, President Vladimir Putin immediately convened Russia's Federal Security Council. He called Jerusalem directly, warning, any action that crosses traditional thresholds will be considered grounds for expanded war. Meanwhile, in Washington, former President Donald Trump, still a powerful voice, told Fox News, Iran crossed the red line and Israel is only defending itself. The White House struck a more cautious tone, issuing a single diplomatic statement. We urge all parties to exercise restraint, but the right to self-defense is undeniable. Within just 48 hours, the world had been drawn into a vortex of conflict that no one had officially declared, but everyone was now part of. At the United Nations, an emergency session was called, but it ended without resolution. Member states were deeply divided. Some criticized Israel for responding with disproportionate force. Others condemned Iran for turning science, education, and civilians into targets of war. Meanwhile, international humanitarian groups pleaded for emergency aid corridors, for thousands of displaced Israelis, and for hundreds of Iranian hospitals, overwhelmed by outages of electricity, water, and blood supplies. The psychological blow didn't stop in the Middle East. On global financial markets, the Dow Jones dropped nearly 1,000 points in a single trading session. Crude oil prices surged to levels unseen since the Ukraine crisis of 2022. Investors fled tech stocks, scrambling instead toward gold, Bitcoin, and other safe haven assets. An emergency G20 meeting was proposed, not to address the humanitarian toll, but to stop the viral-like contagion of capital flight from emerging markets. In East Asia, China, typically silent amid Middle Eastern turmoil, unexpectedly broke its silence. A spokesperson for the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs declared, "We do not accept any actions that destabilize the region. The territorial integrity of nations must be respected." The language seemed neutral, but between the lines, analysts sensed Beijing's growing anxiety about ripple effects threatening its strategic oil and commodity supply chains rooted in the region. While global powers strained to find answers for a crisis without a name, in Israel, curfews were imposed zone by zone. Major cities like Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Ashkelon were categorized by threat level. Citizens were advised not to go out after 7 p.m. The Iron Dome defense system was redeployed, but not to protect the borders. This time, it was guarding seats of power, surviving research centers and cemeteries. And when even cemeteries were being shielded, it became clear war had erased the boundary between life and death. This was a new state, where every symbol, every legacy, every collective memory could become a target. At this point, the most haunting question was no longer who was being killed, but what was being destroyed forever. Trust, pride, the delicate order that held the world in balance between peace and chaos. A French analyst once said, "Modern war does not begin with gunfire, but with the slow slide into gray zones, where no one knows which side they're on anymore." And the Middle East now was precisely that, a massive gray zone. No clear line remained between reaction and provocation, between defense and retaliation, between right and wrong. And when everything becomes that blurred, people begin to see the truth more terrifying than war itself. There are no more neutral zones, no more safe zones. No place is too distant to be unaffected, no power great enough to stand above it all. From that moment forward, the world had entered a wholly new chapter, where theory is powerless against the speed of hatred and the paralysis of trust. Nibra, a historic neighborhood in Jerusalem inhabited by ultra-religious communities, had long been considered a soft exclusion zone, avoided both by the Israeli military and its enemies. Not because it had any special defenses, but because its sacred status and religious significance had turned it, by unspoken consensus, into a space deemed untouchable. Though conflict had raged in many places, Nibra had remained mysteriously serene. Its ancient stone alleys, sun-washed ochre walls, elderly men walking slowly with Torah scrolls, and the steady low hum of dawn prayers. But then, on a moonless night, the first streaks of fire slashed across the sky. A missile, origin unknown, with no warning, struck the corridor leading into one of the most sacred synagogues in the area. The explosion not only shattered the roof tiles, but also tore through the quiet sense of safety the community had clung to for years. Stone dust covered old prayer books. White ceremonial robes were now stained with dust and blood. What followed was a prolonged gasp of grief. Elders curled in corners of their homes, children huddled under altars crying, and men in torn ritual garments still murmuring prayers through the smoke. No one knew what was happening outside, and no one dared to believe that sanctity could still offer protection. Because when even the holiest places are struck, the line between war and everyday life is fully erased. From Jerusalem to smaller towns like Safed, Tiberias, and Acre, anxiety spread like a crack through dry stone. People could no longer distinguish military zones from civilian ones. Churches, schools, gas stations, everything had become a potential target. Not because of strategic value, but simply because they belonged to a society now collectively hated. Then came Gustan, the beating economic heart of Israel, once hailed as the Silicon Valley of the Middle East. It had been a beacon in the region's gloom, home to 24/7 cafes, a morning hive of startup entrepreneurs brainstorming their next big idea. But that morning, Gustan fell silent. Explosions rocked 3 major factories in the southern industrial zone. A section of the power grid went offline. Electric trains stopped, GPS signals flickered. Residents lost contact with their families. With communications cut entirely, local police used loudspeakers to guide people to safety. A child stood on a train track clutching a teddy bear and asked his mother, "Mom, has the war come to Gustan now?" The mother didn't answer, because she no longer knew if any place in this country could still be called safe. And, bitterly, it was now Israel, the nation that once operated a vast security machine to keep war at bay, who was living as Gaza once had. In fear, in doubt, and waking up unsure if the sun would still rise above their rooftops. People began to recall the old saying, "No war is far away when you've lost the feeling of peace inside your own home." That phrase was no longer a philosophy. It was reality, a raw and merciless reality. Along the northern border near Lebanon, villages that once hosted pilgrims were now ghost towns. Residents packed their belongings in the night, not because of evacuation orders, but because they no longer believed in any promise of security. Families left in silence, no tears, no goodbyes, as if they'd grown too tired of having their emotions scattered with each new explosion. In the southern regions along the border with Gaza, Israeli citizens, once feeling secure, superior, distant, now lived in hiding. They moved not by map, but by instinct. Each time a siren wailed, their hearts pounded as if there would be no next time. Boys who once drew pictures of rockets in school now crouched in the corners of their homes asking their fathers, "How do the rockets know where we are?" That question is not easily answered, because modern war is no longer a chess game between 2 players. It is a flood of emotion, where anyone, regardless of wealth, religion, or politics, can be swept away. And the most terrifying part is, no one knows how to stop it. When hatred has sunk deep into the fabric of society, when people no longer speak with words, but with rockets, drones, and bloodied images online, all diplomatic efforts, all peace accords, become little more than silk paper tossed into a sandstorm. There are no more neutral zones. Even nations that once stood on the sidelines are now choosing sides, even if only in silence. There are no more safe spaces. Even places once considered sacred and untouchable, churches, hospitals, research labs, have all fallen one by one. They used to say that in war, children should be the first to be protected. But now, they are the most painful evidence of a failed defense system. Not just one of iron and missiles, but of human conscience. In a short video that went viral, a girl no older than 8 stood amid the rubble holding a charred family photo. She didn't cry. She simply looked into the camera and said, "I don't think God lives here anymore." That sentence needed no analysis, no explanation. It was an indictment of everyone who believed power was the final shield, of everyone who thought technology could save humanity from its own destructive nature. And when a child loses faith in the presence of mercy, what peace could possibly rise from the ruins? Perhaps the only thing left now is a question no one can yet answer. If war becomes humanity's final language, what will we say to each other before there's nothing left to say at all? If war is humanity's final language, then tonight, the Middle East is screaming through the shattered echoes of despair, with no hope left to veil the sound. It's not just the boom of artillery, not just the cries of children buried in rubble, but the broken gasps of mothers who no longer have tears left to cry for their sons. It's the wail of ambulances blending with prayers whispered through the dust. It's ceremonial music cut off mid-note by supersonic missiles. It's silence, cold and suffocating, falling over once sacred places now soaked in blood and doubt. There are no victors here. No side can lift its head amid the wreckage. No declaration, no matter how bold, can mask the truth. Humanity has gone too far. And the saddest part is, no one went this far for ideals, for truth, or for justice. They went because of fear, because of hatred, because of generational anger and wounds that were never allowed to heal. They marched through the night, believing they were chasing the light, only to crash headlong into a flame. Brighter, blinder, crueler. We used to ask, who's right, who's wrong? But now that question means nothing. Because the greatest wrong lies not in one side or the other. It lies in how we've come to accept violence as the language of conflict. It lies in how we turn away from injustice, in every nod to heartless decisions, in every quiet indifference that nourishes the soil where hatred grows. Now, the real question is no longer who's right, but who's still clear-headed enough to stop? Who still has the conscience to look into the eyes of children who no longer dream? Who still has the courage to step out of the game of power and place an olive branch on the table instead of a warhead? Because if no one stops, if no one pauses long enough to listen, then the final cities will turn to ash. Not because our weapons are too powerful, but because our hearts have grown too numb. History isn't just written in blood, it's written in missed chances. Those moments when we could have chosen dialogue, but chose blame instead. Could have chosen healing, but opted for punishment. Could have chosen forgiveness, but clung to victory. We live in an era where war updates arrive by the second, but messages of peace slip from our minds in moments. We build missiles smart enough to evade radar, but not hearts kind enough to deflect hate. We funnel billions into defense budgets, but hesitate when asked to fund a single meal for a refugee. And one day, when the final brick falls, when the smoke settles, we will stand amid the ruins with no one left to blame and realize the one thing we could have done, the thing we should have done long ago, was simply stop. Tonight, in the Middle East, and perhaps in each of our hearts, is a moment for reflection. Not to find an enemy, but to find ourselves. Before the most sacred things are lost, before the children stop believing in tomorrow, before hearts turn to stone and ashes are all that remain of what we once called humanity. If you feel that what's happening isn't just a Middle Eastern tragedy, but a wake-up call for all of us, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more in-depth analysis, real stories, and human perspectives behind the headlines. Leave a comment below. What do you think needs to change for the world to be a little less cold, a little less cruel? A single sentence from you might be a tiny spark, but sometimes that spark is all someone needs to find hope in the dark. Thank you for listening.